Well, first of all, it's an honor to be here. Thank you so much for your time for joining this. My name's Dr. Michelle Boland. I was a Division I collegiate strength conditioning coach for many years, and I was a director of education at a private training facility. And now I own my own fitness company. And why I share that is because over the course of that career, I've kind of created a system that allows people to express movement not only in performance but also gain movement back for general population clients who may have been restricted in certain motions, and which creates a limitation and barrier towards gaining fitness qualities. So I want to share with you today my 3 rules that I've included in my programming and exercise selection for strategies to improve movement quality. So we can go on to the next slide here. And just a disclaimer, I have no conflict of interest related to this presentation. You can move on. Okay, so the 2 objectives here are to learn how to add movement quality implementation strategies to typical bilateral lifts, okay? And then on top of that, understand why it is beneficial. And we can move on here. So the first reason is I want to address why this may be beneficial and why I stated typical bilateral lifts there. So here is a spectrum of adaptation of what I kind of consider movement or the intent of creating different movement qualities. So far to the right, I want you to think about powerlifting and bodybuilders. Activities that are trying to create high levels of force production. And I'm sure everyone at this moment has a picture in their head about, what those type of people look like. And of course, they have a typical body shape. They're pretty short, and their shoulders and hips are equivalent in terms of width side to side. Now, of course, that body shape allows them to succeed in those sports. However, the sports themselves, high force production sports, that type of activity is going to create compressive strategies on the joints. So superficial muscle and gaining muscle, so hypertrophy effects, can actually restrict expansive strategies. Expansive strategies allow movement to occur. So, and if you think about it, if I'm trying to squat as most amount of weight as possible, I don't want a lot of movement to occur. I want to go from point A to point B in the most stable way as possible to be able to manage that loading. I don't actually want a lot of degrees of freedom of motion to be occurring. So a lot of compression happens with those types of activities. And that's a lot of bilateral lifts. Think, bench press, squat, deadlift on 2 feet, hip width apart, feet flat on the ground. Or 2 arms doing the same movement. On the other end of the spectrum left, think more of like a basketball or soccer athlete. They need access to a large degree of movement. They need expansive strategies in their joints, access to all ranges of motion in their joint, and they need to be able to move in any direction at any time. So there's kind of a wide range in between there. And so yes, of course, like the athletes and general population clients that you work with need a little bit of both, but we can't be so extreme at both ends. And you can flip to the next slide. So my 3 rules that kind of blend these 2 worlds together, or really try not to push people all the way right in terms of high force production activity and restricting movement, is I want to put people in offset positions. So that means instead of 2 feet flat on the ground and bilateral stance, feet hip width apart, I can either put them in a staggered stance position as 1 foot in front of the other, front to back, or side to side. And same thing with the arms. One arm is doing one activity or movement, moving in one direction, and the arm is moving in the other direction. The second rule is either offset or non-traditional loading patterns. And so I would say traditional loading patterns in bilateral lifts, so deadlift, squat, bench press, a lot of two hands facing the same way, or loading on the back on both sides. So you'll see a few examples here. I try to do a lot of anterior, so in the front loading patterns, which really helps set the abs as stabilizers. It allows a little bit more movement to occur at the joints. And then offset position, so one side loading. So holding a kettlebell on one side and the other side's maybe reaching forward or unloaded. And then the third one is alternating grips. So I'm turning one hand in supination, the other hand in pronation while I'm holding a bar or kettlebells or dumbbells. And we can flip to the next slide. So all these are basically examples. I wanted to show you as many examples as I possibly could with these types of activities. So typical bilateral lift for a hip hinge is what we consider a deadlift or an RDL movement, where there's two hands on a bar and 2 feet equivalent hip width apart on the ground. So my first rule is putting people in an offset position. So this is gonna bias me towards that back foot side. So I'm teaching people how to shift their weight to one side, to load into a hip hinge. And then this is also an example of an offset loading position. So I have the opposite hand holding the weight, which is going to rotate me in this particular instance to my left side. And if I could have created a fourth rule, I probably would have adding respiratory phases of respiration into your lifts. So inhalation is going to create, think of openings or expansive strategies. So as I come down, if I inhale through my nose, I'm going to open up that backside hip on the left side, okay? So with all of these things combined, yes, I am producing force through this exercise. I'm using an external load to hit multiple different fitness qualities, but I'm also teaching the individual to shift weight front to back. I am teaching alternating movements at the hip. I am creating rotation in the upper body, and so on and so forth, which is going to help improve movement quality. And we can flip to the next one. So more examples here. So this is a ski erg. So if you're doing some conditioning, okay, instead of feet, again, being side by side, I want to create some expansive strategies and teach people how to hip hinge and shift their weight backwards. All I'm doing is putting them in a staggered stance position, and that's feet split front to back, but feet remaining flat. And you can switch to the next slide. Okay. This position is what I would probably categorize as a split stance position. So I have feet split front to back, but my back toe is up, so it's not flat on the ground. In this case, it's wall supported. So with that back leg against the wall, I'm really targeting feeling the heel against the wall, which is going to help me with hip extension. And you'll feel a lot more activity through that backside hip with that wall, the back foot being supported against the wall. But again, a typical, if you think kettlebell swing, would be a bilateral stance, 2 hands on the kettlebell, moving into a hip hinge, and then a powerful hip extension through. But not only can this apply to athletes and performance, there are majority of the time in instances not going to be on 2 feet at the same time. Maybe we can bias them a little bit more to a single leg loading pattern. And for general population clients, normally they're not exposed to moving in different planes of motion besides a sagittal kind of bias movement, which is a bilateral lift. So can we just make some minor tweaks and changes to a typical bilateral exercise, such as the kettlebell swing, split the feet front to back? That's going to really bias the loading through that, in this case, right leg. The opposite hand holding or loading is going to create rotation over that leg with the upper body. And again, that's improving hip range of motion and movement quality through that hip by adding a rotational pattern on top of that without having the leg go outwards or follow the chest. Okay, so this is creating a separation or disassociation between joints by having one area of the body, in this case the upper body, rotate over the other area of the body, in this case the lower leg. And then we can switch sides. So you can be, if anything, I want to show you that you can be very creative in your exercise selection to both add force production, strength, endurance, fitness qualities with the people that you work with, but also get them to move in these alternating patterns, okay? So a typical hang clean, okay, we can use a barbell to do that, but again, it's done in a bilateral stance with a barbell, 2 hands on the bar, okay? We can do the same thing with a kettlebell. So I could do a bilateral stance kettlebell hang clean with 2 hands on the kettlebell and feet equivalent hip width apart. But if I'm following my rules, I can help support movement quality and moving in different planes of motion just by splitting the feet front to back. In this case, I have my back heel elevated, which is going to allow me to get into my right hip in this instance a little bit more. But I am hinging back at the hip. I am producing force to move that kettlebell up, and I'm dropping underneath the load exactly as I would with a barbell in my hand. But now I'm biasing more single leg loading through that back leg just by splitting my feet front to back. And you can switch slides. Okay, push up. This is the upper body example. So 2 hands on the ground, 2 feet on the ground. Okay, that's a bilateral stance. I'm just in a prone position. Here, what I'm doing by elevating my left hand is I'm rotating myself to the left. So I'm creating a little bit of a thoracic rotation towards my left side, okay? And you can also do this with an elevated push-up like on a bar. You could just set the rack holds one higher than the other, and that drops them into a rotational position while you're doing a force production exercise with the upper body. You can switch to the next slide. I'm trying to talk as fast as I possibly can. Okay, so now we're getting a little bit into the second rule. So an offset, so this is just loading on one side of the body while doing a split squat position. And this is what I would call a split stance. So I have feet split front to back, but that back toe is up. But now I'm loading just through my right side, so I'll get a little bit more activation through my right ab wall. We can switch to the next slide. And you can also see that it's an interior hold position. So this is what I call a Zercher hold position. So the dumbbell is sitting between my elbows and my elbows are reaching forward. So what that's gonna do is it's going to set my ribs down. And that's going to activate a lot more abs in the front for a stabilizing position. And it's going to prevent the people that you work with from extending by supporting the load. And it's also, if you see my upper back, my scaps are moving laterally and outward against my rib cage, and that's creating a lot of expansion. A lot of people feel a stretch in their upper back holding the load like this, and that's creating expansive strategies. This helps a lot of people who may be feeling some compression and restriction in their shoulders. And you can flip to the next slide. Okay, so this is a kettlebell deadlift. So I am in a bilateral stance. However, I'm going to use a non-traditional loading scheme and offset by only lifting the kettlebell up with one hand. So you can even see the MBT on my t-shirt gets rotated as my right hand is touching the kettlebell, and then it turns to the other side as my left hand reaches with the kettlebell. So I'm creating rotation in my upper body, supporting movement quality through a force production based activity. You can flip to the next slide. Okay, so this is the third rule, alternating grips. So this is a great way to add movement quality to your activity. So one side of my upper body is doing the opposite than the other. And you can see that my thumbs are facing the knee of my front leg, okay? So that's turning my upper body. You can see my Nike sign is turned towards my front leg, and that's creating a rotation over that leg, which is actually going to help you really get the glute on that front leg a little bit more because I'm turning into that hip. So again, I'm adding some rotation to this exercise that can be a force production loaded based activity. And you can flip to the next slide. Okay, so we have a bilateral stance here. So doing a pull-up, but again, I want to create some rotation in the upper body. So I'm going to hold the bar in supination on one side and pronation on the other, causing a little bit of a turn in my upper body. And then I'm going to perform the pull-up exercise. So again, if I am biasing more towards a bilateral stance, I'm asking the body to squeeze a little bit more and compress a little bit more through these activities. By adding these three rules, I'm allowing a little bit more of an expansive strategy by creating some rotational patterns. Okay, you can flip to the next slide. Okay, so how to include this in your programming. So all of the examples that I showed are based upon my exercise selection. When I'm picking the exercises that I'm going to program for the people that I work with, trying to add in these three rules, and again, if I could add a fourth, it would be adding respiration to the activities. And that's going to allow them to attain all of these fitness adaptations that I want, okay? Strength, power, speed, but also blend in improving joint range of motion and exposing them to, I didn't really give a lot of examples of lateral stances, but more frontal plane, and you saw a lot of transverse plane components added to exercises. So there's two rules I follow for programming. One, you can combine these rules. So combine the spectrum, so movement quality with these three rules and force production. So all of the examples I showed today would be included in that first kind of tip. Or you could pair exercises. So you can do, a heavy typical bilateral lift, so a trap bar deadlift, and then you can pair that exercise or partner it with an exercise that's more of a single loading or rotational movement. So that way, the person is compressing, squeezing, producing force with that first exercise, but then you're exposing them to something that allows them to move in different planes of motion, a little bit more freedom of, degrees of freedom through their joints. So this wouldn't be pairing a deadlift with a box jump, because again, a box jump is moving in the sagittal plane, a bilateral stance. You would want to pick something maybe moving to the side, like a lateral jump, unloaded, so they can not be so compressed and squeezed when they're moving through that activity. And then you can switch to the next slide. Okay, so I hope that was helpful. If you have any additional questions after today, please feel free to reach out to me through any of these points. Feel free to email me. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. And I hope that you enjoy this presentation. Thank you for your time.